I'm Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Coming out of the bye week, we're going to talk about the three biggest things this Steelers offense must do coming out of the bye to take the right step forward. Also, the AFC North sweep in the weekend. What does that mean for the Steelers? We'll talk about that and more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest price guarantee. Hope everyone had a good bye week weekend. I did, whereas I had to work Saturday. Got a little time Sunday, to stretch the legs, do some laundry, clean around the house. That was nice. But let's talk about the Steelers and the biggest thing that has to happen coming out of this bye week, and that is a step forward for this offense. We'll talk about what happened Sunday with the AFC North teams in a bit. But the more and more I was going back throughout this weekend and on my spare time, I was looking at some of the past games and some of the times where I thought key moves, key plays could have been made by the Steelers offense to take a step forward in some of the moments that didn't happen this season. And I made some notes that I just thought would apply moving forward. Some of these might be obvious, some of these might be not. But let's start with the most obvious one, and the one that I've been ringing the bell on this whole time. And a lot of people are going to say the biggest fix is fire Matt Canada. They're not doing that. They brought this. We know the Steelers aren't doing that. So let's think about what can actually happen if the Steelers are going to take a step forward with who they have right now. Number one, and I think this goes before Kenny Pickett, before anything else, the offensive line has to be stronger and more unified in how they're trying to play moving forward. We saw steps of that moving forward in the second half against the Ravens. Looked like they were starting to find their footing. Broderick Jones in his first start started to tee off with Isaac Seumalo. But some key factors to make this happen. These guys have to start being in the same place at the same time as far as understanding how to work together, getting off on the same foot at the same time, being able to win across the board. That's what the best offensive lines do. You see that happen with teams that are able to control the line of scrimmage. It's not that one guy is leading the charge. It's that they're working together. You can go back to the Marquise Pouncey years when him and David DeCastro were there. It wasn't just them winning. Their winning helped everybody else do that. And that's where the Steelers need somebody to step up in that front. Could it be Isaac Seumalo? I think it could be. James Daniels, if he comes back from injury. Maybe Broderick Jones could even be a part of that if he steps up this year and continues to play well. But the bottom line is they have to get on the same book, and they have to start working better on their combo blocks when they're working together. And I also think Matt Canada does need to give them more chances to power block. Let them get off the ball. Let them go forward and charge against the defense, using more power runs, getting downfield, letting this team go be physical the way that they were talked about they were supposed to be all season long. Another thing here for the offensive line, all still under fixing the offensive line, get your combo blocks to help Mason Cole out in the run game. Because right now, Mason Cole, he is, I'd say, easily the weakest link of the five starters if you're considering Broderick Jones a starter now after the way that he played. But I think one thing that I saw in that Ravens game, the times that Mason Cole looked the best was when he knew he had Herbig helping him on a double team or Seumalo helping him on a double team, and he was able to chip and get to a linebacker and at least do that. When he was one-on-one against guys in the trenches at A-gap, that's when he was struggling the most in the run, and that was blow up holes for Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. And this is why, again, I think getting back to the power run and doing more plays that let these guys go downfield, not as much zone blocking where it's more one-on-one focus. Let that happen. Work on those combo blocks, double team, then chip to the backer. That can be what helps Mason Cole and frees up the middle part of the field to allow for more space to run and make it so that Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren are both maybe getting 2-3 yards before they have to worry about the first defender instead of doing that in the backfield. And of course, also, this group has to communicate better in pass protection. We saw some of their pass rushes that they gave up pressures on. Sometimes it was just miscommunications early on in the season. I think that improved going into the bye with the way that they finished against the Ravens. For example, Broderick Jones, one pressure was just a play where he just gave up his inside shoulder. He was able to correct it, didn't do it again in the game. I thought that was impressive. They do those three things, getting off on the same foot, work on those combo blocks to help Mason Cole, and communicating better in pass protection and making sure that they are on that same page. Those things can go a long way to fixing the offensive line and making them more of that unified front. Again, they don't need to be elite. They don't need to be a top 10 unit, but make them a more solid and more consistent unit, and this team can do a little bit more. The second thing that the offense needs to do, and this does involve Matt Canada and getting Matt Canada getting Kenny Pickett to see this, but working in more layered concepts, passing concepts, to give Kenny similar looks where he doesn't have to move his eyes as much. It's obvious right now that Kenny Pickett, and we know that he's seen it in college, and we've seen it in glimpses where he can see the field, survey things, and process things, and work in a quick rate. But he has to do that more consistently. One of the easier things that you can do is layering those looks to create those opportunities. And it's something that has been called. Matt Canada has called these layered. When I'm talking about layered pass concepts, I'm talking about when multiple routes kind of work in the same part of the field. So Kenny Pickett doesn't necessarily have to move from the left sideline to the right sideline. He's looking sort of on a hash, and he says, okay, you have one guy maybe 5 yards up and another guy maybe 20 yards up, and that forces defenses to make decisions, especially against those zones. But I think that more of those need to be given to him, and he needs to be coached into seeing those and understanding the different keys he has to focus on to make the right reads in those throws. And again, these type of reads have been given by the Steelers at times. In fact, the 4th and 1 play against the Texans that everyone complained about, Connor Hayward and Calvin Austin were both over the middle part of the field and were open. Kenny Pickett just didn't see them, and that led to him panicking, running out of the pocket and getting himself sacked on that play. But I do think that if he's going to be the guy, these are the plays he does have to see. And maybe this is something that you work more into the offense to get that to happen. And when you look at those layered passing concepts, you can do that, especially over the middle, and include the running backs more. I think the one thing the Steelers offense that they do a lot of, they throw their running backs to the flat to give Kenny Pickett an easy dump off pass option a lot of times, whether it's Jalen Warren or Najee Harris, but have them run some Texas routes. We know they can do it. Najee Harris ran a lot more complex routes than that at Alabama. Jalen Warren, I mean, we've seen him make cuts and make plays, with the, going to catch the ball in the air. Doesn't have to be complex, but a Texas route, simple, out and in, just cut out, angle back in, and while he's doing that, you can have Pat Freiermuth hitting a seam, assuming he's healthy. You can have a deep post from George Pickens. You can have an in. Deontay Johnson's coming back. You can use a slot receiver like Calvin Austin to run up a seam or run a slant, something along those lines to just force defenders in the similar parts of the field to have to make tough decisions, especially in zones, and that will make things a lot easier. And that leads to my third point here that has to also be part of this. The Steelers have to coach Kenny Pickett into attacking seams more when the defenses go into their zone coverages. I think it's one of the biggest weaknesses the Steelers have. They're really good at the back shoulder throw when they're starting to connect on it, and that's the thing. But that's, as everyone says, that's a lower percentage throw. You're throwing it to the sideline. You're having the ball travel as far as it has to horizontally for there to be a simple completion instead of over the middle. This is where it has to happen. Now, again, these plays have been called at times. There was a play against the Ravens where George Pickens was lined up in the middle of the formation, and the Ravens were in a zone, and the only two defenders around him were Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen. And it was a linebacker on a wide receiver, something that Steelers fans complain that happens to the Steelers defense a lot, and Pickens was open in the middle of the seam. But Kenny Pickett didn't recognize it. Eventually the pressure got there, and he didn't process it, and it led to a missed opportunity. Doing that, getting Kenny Pickett to see those opportunities and to recognize those has to be a big focus here. Again, Matt Canada, I do have complaints with some of his play calls, or sometimes I'm like, man, and for example, I think that they need to be calling more power runs than zone runs moving forward. That's a big part of what I think the Steelers have to do in the run game. But there are times where his play calls are just fine as far as concept-wise and what's there and available, but it's still part of his job to get Kenny Pickett to see those things that are available and getting him to understand this is what you need to watch. Not your own players, not your own routes, not Deontay Johnson or George Pickens, but where are the defenders lined up? Trust that your players are going to be where you practiced that they would be in those situations. And that kind of stuff, it takes time. Jalen Hurts, the way that he's been playing in the NFL the last year and a half or so, That didn't come right away. He struggled coming out the gate. Trevor Lawrence, we didn't see him start to take steps forward. Joe Burrow in his rookie year wasn't entirely great. There's all sorts of guys that took time to develop, and Kenny Pickett has now played officially 17 starts, so he's had that time. So now it's time for him to start taking the step forward, and you'd like it to have done it sooner, but you can't do anything about that now. Kenny Pickett, focus on those things. Matt Canada, his biggest task isn't necessarily improving play calling. It's getting Kenny Pickett to take the plays that are already there in this Steelers offense. If that happens, and if they layer more concepts over top of each other to make that job easier for him, and the offensive line becomes more unified, this offense becomes a different unit, and this team becomes a different team, because then the defense won't have as much pressure on it to have to always be the unit that carries this team to a win, like it has in most of it and all three of its wins so far. But the defense also has things to clean up. We'll talk about that on the other side of this break here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, especially focusing on the run defense, because even though they were able to step up against the Ravens, there's still things I'm not so sure about, and I'm going to talk about those points here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We have a lot to discuss right here. But first, we got to remind you that this show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the app you can go to right now to buy tickets for your favorite events, and it shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is a fast and easy way to buy tickets for all your sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. You can also go to the website, gametime.co, and you'll find killer deals on last-minute tickets, and they have a best price guarantee that can't be beat, where you stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun that you're about to have. The Game Time app allows you to book tickets up to the last minute, even an hour after the event has already began. And when you go into the Game Time app, if you're not sure about your seat and where it's at, you can just look at it and it'll show you the view from that seat, so you know you're not getting ripped off by the prices that you see, and the prices that you see are the actual prices that you will pay. You're not going to get hit with hidden fees. It's just simple. 2 taps on the seats that you want, and they can be yours in the Game Time app. Download the Game Time app today, and the best price guarantee means when you go on Game Time and you buy tickets, if you find tickets in the same section and row for less somewhere else, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference in those prices. Snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase, or go to their website, gametime.co. Terms and conditions apply. Create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. We're also brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. All you have to do is pick two or more players, and if you guess more or less than their projected stats, and you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. Prize Picks is the fun new daily fantasy game where you're not playing against thousands of people. You're not playing to have the best lineup. You're just picking players that you think you have a beat on in their day in fantasy and saying they're going to get more or less than their projected stats. Is TJ Watt going to have more than a sack in the Steelers next game? Say more or less, and if you're right, that can be part of your winning lineup to make money. And again, it's just 2 to 6 players that you're looking at and saying, hey, more or less on a certain stat, and that can be up to 25 times your money. And Prize Picks also has a unique feature that can be very helpful. Prize Picks reboot policy allows your entries to stay in play even if one of your players gets injured in the first half for all NFL and college football top 25 matchups. If a player who exits the game in the first half does not return in the second, that player is then rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports game with injury insurance, so check out Prize Picks today. And they also have weekly promotions with big payouts like Taco Tuesday, where each Tuesday Prize Picks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide even more value. And Prize Picks also does NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, college sports, and so much more. Download the Prize Picks app today. Go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. Use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here. So let's talk about a few things on defense, especially because I think that the Steelers defense has, shown progress at different points, but also shown regression. The 49ers game, they got beat up pretty bad. Then the Browns game, they made a lot of splashy plays, weren't as consistent. The Raiders game looked like they started to figure some things out. And then the Texans game looked like they were back to square one. But then here we go again in the Ravens game. They give up a touchdown drive early, but then adjust and play a very solid game for the rest. Even though the Ravens did also drop 2 touchdowns and mess up a lot themselves, they were able to rebound and take away the other parts of the game to give them a shot to win that game. Now, the key thing is for the Steelers, they have to get the run defense fixed moving forward. And this is a run defense that, when we look at how they played, the only team that they've really completely stuffed the run on was the Raiders when they allowed 69 yards, to them in their win there. But every other game they've allowed over 100 yards against the Ravens. They did allow the least other than the Raiders game with 125, but you still want to have a better look there, especially against teams. Now the Ravens do have Lamar Jackson. They have a unique piece here. The Rams could be an interesting test. Kyron Williams had a really big game for the Rams in this past weekend against the Cardinals. This could be a test on the road to see, hey, are you ready to stuff the run and be more consistent there? But I have some notes just in watching film and things that I think could lead to better run defense moving forward, because right now the Steelers run defense, it's bad. I mean, objectively, and how they performed overall. They ranked 28th in total yards going into this past weekend, and they ranked 26th in yards per attempt. Those things have to change if you're the Steelers defense and you want to have the identity of being a good unit this year. They've been able to survive that so far, but that will not work all season long. So what do they need to do to fix it? For the first thing, chemistry needs to continue to grow. I've seen and I've talked about it a little bit on film, but there's times where there's players that they're executing certain parts of schemes, but they're not really doing it in concert with each other. For example, there were plays against the Texans where you would see DeMarvin Leal stunt inside, and his interior defensive lineman, I believe on one particular play, Leal was playing on the edge a little bit more, and the interior defensive lineman, I forget it was Isaiah Loudermilk, but it was an interior defensive lineman, and he stunted inside, and there was supposed to be a twist that came outside to maintain gap integrity, but that twist never came, and then they were both in the same gap, which allowed a run to the outside of them. Those type of things have happened a little bit more often at the start of this year, and that kind of stuff happens with newer players, younger players and especially players who are trying to learn to work together. I remember covering, I think it was the 2017 Steelers, and we started to see Stephon Tuitt and Bud Dupree start to build connections like that, along with TJ Watt and Cam Hayward. And I think it was actually initially that season when TJ Watt was on one side of the formation, because remember, he was on one part, they actually flipped the defensive tackles to build more chemistry with each of them, and they wanted those guys each to kind of learn how to build off each other. And eventually, though that four developed a tandem that they could all four work together. But it took time for each group pairing to work together to understand, hey, this is how we're going to react with different runs, different pass rushes, and that's where I'm talking about with chemistry. And when you look at the Steelers defense, there's a lot of guys that are still working on how to work together. There's TJ Watt with other guys. Now, him and Larry Ogunjobi, Cam Hayward, those guys might be in there, but that's something that DeMarvin Leal, Keanu Benton, guys like that, they have to kind of work on. Armin Watts, even Montravius Adams, all those guys have to understand when and where to do things, and when they're doing one thing, trusting that their teammate is going to be doing the other, so that they're in concert, covering up the right gaps and attacking the run the right way. And the same thing goes for the linebackers. They look sharper in this last game against the Ravens, but that has to be a sharper that continues to build, not slack off. I've been one to say Cole Holcomb, coming into the season, I thought he'd be a huge difference maker. In the first game, he was not. The second game, he was. Third game, not as much. Fourth game against the Texans, he was abysmal. And then fifth game against the Ravens, right back out there on top. But they need to stop the roller coaster there. The linebackers have to be more consistent. I think one thing that needs to happen, Quan Alexander needs to be a starter. The way he played against the Ravens is a really good sign that, hey, that dude could be your guy in the middle of the defense, set the tone. He was helping against the pass, helping against the run. He was playing well in space, understanding his assignments and understanding how to play with his teammates. That stuff can carry over to the rest of your team and be something that you look at moving forward. Also, to help against the run, not just the linebackers, your other off-ball presence comes from your secondary here. And that's something that they think the Steelers, they need to start working in Desmond King. Unless Desmond King is just some really bad player, because we don't see, and we don't get to see it because we're not studying practice like that. I feel like anyone in the slot would be more helpful than the Shannon Sullivan, who's been in the slot mostly for the Steelers going in. If that's Patrick Peterson in the slot because Joey Porter's on the outside, fine, do that. If that's Keanu Neal bumping to the slot because you want a bigger slot safety option there, fine, do that too. But have somebody, Elijah Riley, I think would even be better in that situation. But especially against the run, when you're in those nickel packages, you need that nickel to also be able to help in those situations, because a lot of teams will come out in formations, in personnel packages that force you into nickel packages, and you still need that player on the slot to come up and help. And Shannon Sullivan just hasn't been that guy. And if they get someone who can help there, it can help everything else start to come into formation and force more of those predictable passing downs that Mike Tomlin often talks about, where you can pin your ears back as pass rushers. You can dial up more just coverage centric packages that are looking to confuse quarterbacks that you know are passing and want and need to get 8, 9, 10 yards to move the sticks. Those type of things can also help free up Minkah Fitzpatrick and let him be a pure safety again. I truly believe part of the problem that I've been talking about with Minkah Fitzpatrick and him moving all over the place, I think that's part of it is that, they're still not trusting all of the guys that they have in the secondary to do different jobs at different times. I also think part of it, they're trying to get Minkah Fitzpatrick in different parts of the formations to try to confuse quarterbacks so that they can't just look at know that he's in one part of the field. But again, we've seen that it hasn't worked. They need to be able to have guys who they can trust, win in the off-ball situations, win against the run, so that Minkah Fitzpatrick can be in that role. And listen, Minkah Fitzpatrick, good tackler. He's fine when he's coming up to help in the run, and he brings that energy. That's great and all, but that is not as valuable as the interceptions he can get on the backside of the defense, the help he can provide on the deep balls, and helping with double even the team's other top receivers that are going at you. I mean, you've been picked apart by number one receivers multiple times this season. That's where Minkah Fitzpatrick can help you, especially when you're not so confident in your cornerbacks right now. Levi Wallace, I think, has slowly progressed and he's trending upwards. Patrick Peterson, I still think is a question mark if he fits. And Joey Porter Jr., he's played well, but he's a rookie. Eventually he's going to make mistakes. You need to give him some help there. Again, do these other things. Let Desmond King or Keanu Neal or somebody, Elijah Riley, whoever, help in the slot so that they can help stop the run better, get the linebackers sharper, get the chemistry going, and let these guys build their chemistry together. All those things can lead to this Steelers defense getting back to the identity that we've seen them have over the past 2 or 3 years, when we've seen the core of these guys. And the core of these guys, I mean TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Minkah Fitzpatrick, guys like that. And Larry Ogunjobi started to work into that last year. And when Cam Hayward does come back, he's hopping on a moving train and not a defense that's still looking to figure things out in late October, early November. Those are the things that have to happen for this run defense moving forward. If it does not, it will continue to be a problem, and the Steelers will still be hanging around the 500 record instead of pushing forward with their positive record right now. And that could lead to big problems, because the AFC North, as we'll talk about in the next segment, had a big weekend, all three teams winning in big fashions, and could be a sign that this is going to still be that competitive division that everyone talked about. But we'll get to that on the other side of this break here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We got a few more things to talk about right after this break. But first, we got to remind you this show is also brought to you by LinkedIn. That LinkedIn is here to help employees find new jobs every single day. But here, if you're an employer, they can also help you find the right hires for your small business to fire on all cylinders. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in, to make it easier to find new people that you want to talk to faster and for free. All you have to do is create a free job post in minutes on LinkedIn Jobs to reach your network and beyond to the world's largest professional network of over 810 million people. And add your job in purple hashtag hiring frames to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring, so your network can help you find the right people to hire. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Did you know every week nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our talk here, and we're going to take a step away from the Steelers for a moment and look at the NFL Sunday weekend that was. There were quite a few upsets this weekend. The Jets upsetting the Eagles. didn't see that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that means there are no more undefeated teams in the NFL right now. If I remember correctly, there were 2 undefeated teams going into this weekend. It was the Niners and the Eagles. Yes, the Niners and the Eagles. Niners lost to the Browns. We'll get to the Browns shortly. I want to lead off with the Ravens game. That was the first game in the morning. This was another sign of why I always respect the Ravens. Even when they are still figuring things out, they're going to be able to find a ways to outperform their opponents, and get themselves a good chance. That defense is still competitive. They still make things tough on people. Lamar Jackson isn't, the elite quarterback that Joe Burrow can be when he's healthy, but he still gives you such a good chance to win every game that you're in. 21 of 30, 223 with a touchdown and an interception, ran for 62 yards, leading the Ravens effort there, and gave them a shot there. And I thought the Ravens were going to beat the Titans. The Titans, I think that they're an average to slightly below average team right now, especially with their quarterback situation. Ryan Tannehill got hurt. We'll see how that plays out because the Steelers have the Titans in a few weeks here. That could be a big storyline to watch going into that Thursday night football game coming up in a few weeks. But again, the Ravens winning, they're back in first place at 4-2. That's fine. The Steelers already have 1 win over them. If they can win the next one, they'll be able to handle their business and do what they need to do to pass up the Ravens. But again, when the whole AFC North wins in a weekend that you're on a bye, it kind of puts the pressure on you that, hey, you got to be able to keep winning. You can't stay at just 500 ball all season because, as we said, this division is going to be talented this year, and it's going to be tough to win it. Let's talk about the Bengals game because that was a game that I thought the Seahawks could win, and they absolutely could have and maybe even should have. The Seahawks defense still limited the Bengals. They scored just 17 points. Joe Burrow threw an interception in this game. The Seahawks were able to get after him. I believe they had 3 sacks in this game, getting after him. This was a game that also the Seahawks had 2 red zone possessions in the fourth quarter and came away with 0 points from both of them because they kept going for it on fourth down. Pete Carroll yet again making just kind of, I think, silly decisions in the red zone there. I know analytics will say, yo, you go for it because you get 2 chances at scoring touchdowns. Well, if you had just kicked the field goal on the first one, you would have had a chance to kick another field goal on the second one, and that would have won you the game in the end. Ultimately, the Seahawks, I thought that they had some decent chances here and there, but Geno Smith, he got rattled in the pocket. He threw 2 interceptions, 2 bad interceptions on this game. The biggest takeaway I had from this game that the Steelers need to look at with the Bengals is that defense still isn't a joke yet. And that's the thing, was that there would wonder, would this defense fall apart without their safeties that left, Jesse Bates and Von Bell. And I do think they've taken a step back, but they can still get after the quarterback. They can still play physical, and that's what the Steelers are going to have to watch moving forward with this Bengals team, especially with the way that they got after Geno Smith. I believe they had 4 sacks on him, and some of those came late in the game when it was time for the Seahawks to start airing it out, and they started pinning their ears back, and they were getting after him, and that Seahawks offensive line just couldn't handle it, and Geno Smith couldn't handle it. That's going to be a sign for Kenny Pickett when these games come, and those games are going to come in the middle part of the year to the late part of the year. The offensive line and Kenny Pickett are going to need to step it up because those are going to be huge divisional games that could decide the fate of the season, the playoff hopes, and the division. And they're going to have to be ready for a Bengals pass rush that was bringing it this past weekend. The Bengals definitely earned the win with their defensive stands they made late, but the Seahawks definitely left it out there. Now, the Niners, they choked terribly against the Browns. And shout out to PJ Walker. He did exactly what you're supposed to do as a backup quarterback in that situation, made smart decisions, was able to protect the football for the most part, was able to get them down in some good field position parts. And yes, there was definitely some very questionable calls that helped the Browns out at different times, but you got to give credit to PJ Walker. Yes, he threw 2 interceptions, but 18 of 34, 192, did just enough to help the Browns in certain spots. They were able to key up some runs at different times. And we know that Browns defense, they're going to still be good. They're still going to be physical. But I think that they were able to capitalize on a Niners team that was definitely missing Christian McCaffrey once he got hurt in that game. Him being out was a huge boost there. And also Deebo Samuel, who when both of those guys went out, there were less options for the Niners offense, and they weren't able to take over. Brock Purdy missed some key plays in this one, threw an interception. This is the first game that Brock Purdy has started and finished and lost as the starter for the Niners since he's come into the NFL. That's crazy to think about, but a huge win for the Browns, because if they fall to 2-3 there, and then they're coming out of their bye and they still have things to answer for, they could have been on a fall. Now this buys them time for Deshaun Watson to come back and still be competitive here. Now, again, the good thing for the Steelers is they've beaten the Browns. They've beaten the Browns while the Steelers were still figuring these things out. But this is, again, I think, an urgent sign. The Steelers need to figure things out soon, because right now they went from first place last week to they're still in second place, but these teams are right up on them, and this AFC North is not going to thin out with who's pushing for first place right now. The Ravens are in first place at 4-2. The Steelers are a half game back at 3-2, and the Browns are tied with them, technically behind because of the tiebreaker at 3-2. But now the Bengals are sitting at 3-3. And again, this puts a lot of emphasis to keep pace with these other teams, and the Steelers, games against the Rams. Whereas this is one of the games you technically could lose, because that would be an NFC opponent and that wouldn't cost you as much in tiebreaker scenarios. At this rate, you need to start building wins to get above 500 to kind of protect yourself later in the season for if more injuries happen and you're put in a tough spot and you have to drop one of these games, or you do have some of those games. And this is where the Steelers, I think, are going to have to. They're in a tough division. They're in a conference that's going to have a competitive playoff push. Again, the Jets, a team that we all thought would fade once Aaron Rodgers was out for the season, just beat the Eagles, and now the Jets are 3-3 and looking at it. If the Steelers lose this next weekend, they'll be tied with that record, and that could put the Steelers in a tough spot moving forward. But this is why I think it's ever so urgent that right now, coming out of the gate, the Steelers have to start stacking. They have to show progress, and if these things don't show progress, they can start falling to the back of the herd, and that is not something that they can afford to do. I think the past few years they've been very strong in how they finished to get out of the hole, to at least give them a chance to finish strong. They finished 9-8 last year, and I believe 9-8 the year before that. In the way they finished in those games, you saw them make those pushes. I think it was actually 9-7-1 2 years ago, but either way, you saw them make pushes to kind of get back into it after stumbling out of the gates. They haven't exactly jumped out of the gates into a lead, but they have at least gotten a decent start to be right with the pack. Now you cannot afford to fall behind, and this AFC North is not going to make it easier on you as you move forward. Lots to continue talking about here, because this Rams game could be very vital in making sure that you get into that jump, as you got some AFC opponents coming up right after that, and AFC opponents who could be playoff contenders that you're battling with for tiebreakers down the stretch. But I think the Rams could be an interesting test for the Steelers. The Rams, they got their win over the Cardinals, and the way the Rams play, if the Steelers are able to counter that, could be a big sign that maybe the Steelers are figuring some things out, because I think the way the Rams try to execute on offense could be the very thing that taps into what the Steelers have struggled with the most, and that's passing the ball to targeted to wide receivers and putting the cornerbacks in situations where they have to be the ones who make plays. But we'll talk about that more on our Tuesday episode when we resume here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, continuing to get ready for the week and for Mike Tomlin Tuesday as that kicks off as well. Thanks for tuning into the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Find me here on your favorite podcast, on the Locked On Steelers podcast, on your favorite podcasting apps, or on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes. Again, I'll be back Tuesday with more on your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.